At this point, we are going to have a panel where all three of the speakers who you've just heard from will discuss their work together, and we have an opportunity to ask them more questions about it. Dr. Hyman, Dr. Vries, Dr. Kious. There you go. So in the boxes on my screen, you're not exactly together, but did you have comments that you wanted to make to each other about what you've heard?
No, I really enjoyed both talks. And also Eric Parent's question, I've already about ethnic categories. I've sort of reorganized in my mind the response we all got to together about the flexibility, needing categories initially to do research, and then stepwise sort of dissolving them when they're no longer helpful. But these were great. I really enjoyed the talks. And Brent, I did put something in the chat. It's been my habit. Maybe you can tell I can be cantankerous. It's been my habit to call the FDA when and some of my colleagues at the Stanley Center when we see companies offering completely absurd genetic tests. And sometimes we've gotten, they know us and we know them from other things. And sometimes we've gotten a response. And it is challenging, but some of these things really do border on the fraudulent. The company that you kept calling that seemed to, checking their website, they seem to be offering some things that were impossible. And I'm just curious whether you think I'm having too dark a view of this, or whether there really are fraudulent claims for people to spend their money without much care about what sharing these putative results do to the people.
Well, I wish that some of my legal colleagues were here to talk to this point, because they know a lot more than I do. But my sense is that the regulatory climate is really such that it's hard to call these things fraud, because the standard for effectiveness or usefulness is actually very low. It's not obvious that what Genomind does has to be clinically validated or shown to be effective in any way.
Well, if they make health claims, 23andMe did get into trouble making claims about Parkinson's, and their initial defense was that they were libertarian, so they didn't need to be regulated, and that apparently didn't work.
Right, and so they, Genomind is very fastidious in not making health claims.
Yeah, so that's right. So then the regulators have no purchase. The other thing I would just say in this vein, and then there are probably many more interesting things and questions from the larger group, is I did talk to both US and European regulators about the use of polygenic scores for embryo screening for non-medical purposes. And the response was, because pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is already an approved procedure, it was developed for things like Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis and aneuploidy. This now becomes really a societal issue, not one where they can decide that this test is premature or that one might have bad social outcomes.
Right, the procedure exists, so the application of the procedure is up to whoever might want to do it.
Yes, correct, yep.
Abdication of responsibility entirely.
Anna says it's different in the UK.
Yeah, well, therefore, everything in PGD, there's an approved list of conditions that you can screen for, which has its own issues, of course, defining what's on that list, but completely unregulated here. And there's many who would advocate that that's the way it should stay, including some of those in the disability rights community who don't think we should be in the business of stating what makes a life worth living, et cetera, et cetera.
Steve, this is maybe like a side issue, but I noticed when you were listing the genes with de novo mutations that are associated with schizophrenia, they're all the same genes that are associated with epilepsy as well.
Oh, and well, that was exactly the point. I didn't mention epilepsy. I mentioned neurodevelopmental disorders and bipolar
Autism.
disorder.
Yeah,
But I think, so it's just a warning to all of us, whether it is in advising families or whether it's in doing science. You know, somebody will make a knockout and call it a mouse model of schizophrenia, and somebody else could get the mouse from them and call it a mouse model of epilepsy, or, you know, and that's bad for science. And I think, I just think we have to have greater recognition that of the extraordinary complexity of what genes are telling us. It is the, you know, we've talked a bit about essentialism. It's essentialism, or at least a kind of reductive thinking, is very useful in writing grants and papers, but it's not true.
right. And the pleiotropy is such a challenging issue in what we do, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, you know, we think of disorders as being genetically complex when the genes that cause them have low penetrance and act together with many other genes. But in fact, there's a lot of complexity, even with monogenic causes.
Putatively monogenic. You know, people would call Fragile X monogenic, but how many RNAs is bound by FMRP? 800, depending on, if you believe the Darnell's paper. You know, one has to be a tactical reductionist sometimes to get anything done, but then you better not end up there. You know, have to look more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. It isn't, they aren't monogenic because obviously there's something else causing the difference in the phenotype, whether it's genetic or environmental.
Well, gene-gene interactions matter a great deal. We've talked about, and I've talked, you know, I think Jantina gave a very thoughtful answer about the challenges and the importance, but the challenges of studying the environment. But it, you know, many people have answered the question, why do you work on genes and not the environment? And the answer is because it's easier.
Yeah. We have two other comments. Brandy Fox.
Hello, I was just wondering if the panel could address a question I had a little bit about the difference or the similarities between the public or the consumers and the people doing the research and the scientists. What are the different intentions behind why they're doing this research, and what are the different expectations? Because I don't think those two things match up.
I have, I guess, one thing to say about that. And it's clear from our interaction with community groups that their main interest in research period, whether it's the genetic studies or even participating in focus groups about the ethics of the genetic research, is to do things that will positively impact their family members and communities. When we've been trying to put together additional focus groups involving underrepresented minority groups in Utah through some community organizations, and the first thing that they say to us is, how is this going to benefit our community? Which I think is a really reasonable question and a hard one to answer some of the time.
Randy, you know, scientists are humans and they're pretty diverse, and there are really good, you know, people in many places in the world doing absolutely cutting edge research who are doing genetics as the best clues to disease mechanism, right? For whether it's for cancer or for schizophrenia. We don't, in psychiatry, we don't have access to brain tissue, and even if we did, wouldn't be all that helpful because these are diseases of widely distributed circuits. And we all know that we're using drugs that were discovered serendipitously in the 1950s, and we're not exactly curing people. And so there's a great motivation to use genetics to understand biology, there is a more ethically fraught and difficult, more social science related genetics we've been talking about risk prediction. And probably people think somewhat differently. They probably don't talk to each other as much as you would hope. And then this stuff becomes an industry, right? So, you know, we had this candidate gene era that it was quite clear that it was not science. In fact, we had a policy at NIMH. We never funded a single extramural candidate gene grant application in the late 1990s because it was so clearly not science. And yet, you know, because you could get publications, you could get other grants, because reviewing our intramural program was after the fact instead of before the fact, it just has gone on and on and on and on. And yesterday we heard about MAOA, which is one of the nonsensical pseudo findings. So they're, you know, and are they being unethical? No, they're engaged in Thomas Kuhn's normal science, right? Pursuing leads that their community believes are meaningful and publishing papers and getting grants. So I think scientists are very diverse.
Anna?
You're on mute. So where sorry, can I?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Jantina.
Sorry, Ruth. So I was, Brandy, there's an assumption or a background to your question that I find quite interesting, and that I don't quite completely understand, and maybe you want to speak to why you asked that particular question or not. But from what I think you're asking, the work that we're doing on the African continent in genomics is, I think, very different. So there is no critical mass of scientists that pursue science, of genomic and genetic scientists that pursue, you know, scientific research, genomic research for the sake of conducting genomics, right? The kind of Thomas Kuhn paradigm followers, kind of that Steve spoke about. In my experience, and what we've seen very clearly in H3 Africa is that many of the researchers that are the research leaders on those H3 Africa projects are clinicians first, right? So their day-to-day job as clinicians, they happen to be scientists as well, because there's not many other people that would be doing the science, and the funding's there, and there's an important question that needs to be pursued. And so in my experience of participating as an ethicist, I guess, in that particular consortium quite actively, what that kind of genomics research is very close to social need, right? It's very close to thinking about or being concerned about a particular burden or epidemiology of disease that is ignored or underappreciated, that needs to be addressed in order for those clinicians to do a better job at servicing their patients, right? And that connection is very direct. And that seems to me to be fundamentally different. And the genomics research that is conducted in the context of a consortium like H3 Africa seems to me to be fundamentally different from the kind of research that merely or uniquely works on identifying polygenic risk scores, for instance, for a particular illness. And I think what happens, and this is part of it ties into a broader problem of equity and equality and diversity, is that if that research, what happens is that these things sometimes get developed, are transported to different contexts, where people in those contexts become the consumers or recipients of scientific developments elsewhere that seem to have no bearing on the health needs of the populations of the people in particular parts of the world. And so, I mean, I don't know whether that is kind of the sentiment that was behind your question about a connection between the pursuit of science for the sake of science versus the pursuit of particular kinds of science because there is a social need.
It was, and that was very helpful. My original thought came from the old conflict of clinical work versus research work. And so I was thinking more about the ethical implications for what do these genetic testing companies, how much of their intent do they need to, I guess, disclose to their consumers? You know, are you doing this because it's going to be helpful for someone's health, or are you doing it because it's information that you have and you know people will give you money for it?
But in the context of that question, I think it's probably also quite helpful to point out that the researchers conducting the research are not necessarily the same people as the ones that are commercializing it.
True.
Right. So Brent and his group are doing research that help, or Dr. Kuhn and others doing research because they are close to a burden of disease that needs to be addressed. There's others that commercialize that same research, and those are different people, I think.
Dr. Kuhn and Dr. Doherty have told me that they're receiving an average of 2 or 3 emails every month from companies that want to commercialize their results.
Yeah.
They say no.
Good to
but
know.
That may not make a difference in the long run.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Anna.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all 3 panelists. This has been very interesting. I wanted to pick up on Steve's term of tactical reductionism. And for me, that's been a bit of a theme of the conference over the last couple of days. And I think very often what we try and do in ethics type research is counterbalance that tactical reductionism in various different ways. And I think some of the things that Jantina was just saying, and also then some of the things that Steve was saying about, when we knew that there were things wrong with the candidate gene paradigm, for example, but nonetheless they persisted. Like, I'm wondering what can we really do? What can people like us do to help counterbalance that tactical reductionism in the places where it most needs counteracting? Sorry, it's kind of an abstract question, just in case that prompted anything.
Well, that's a difficult question. I guess I've had the experience more than once in my life of allocating funds to different areas of research. That's what NIH Institute directors, that's really the job in the end. And I think it's very risky candidate gene stuff was a funny case because the genetics professionals, anyone with even a rudimentary applied math background just knew it couldn't possibly yield useful data. But normally it's really hard, and you want to support basic science without which there is no platform for these more applied, including applications to health kind of science. And people argue, argue is really try to deliberate about what should be the balance of funding. And then of course we're very much a rich country, so it's a different discussion here. There's secondarily, and you may think, you may at the end decide I haven't really answered your question, but secondarily, there's also an argument about DALIs. And here, the global health, even for US projects, global health begins to figure. That is unaddressed disease burden. And there, the argument is very interesting, which are there scientific opportunities to do anything? So, not many years ago, before the genetic revolution, people who cared about talented scientists would tell them not to work on schizophrenia as a neurobiological phenomenon, because there was no traction, right? So here was this unmet need that was profound and obvious, and yet there was no toehold. And how do you get a toehold? And once genetics provided some traction, then lots of people have barreled into psychiatry. It's lovely, right? Doing lots of very diverse things because there's some traction. But this argument about unaddressed burden and then whether the science is there to do anything about it weighs heavily across all health research funding decisions. And, you know, if you're too stingy, then nothing happens. That's good. But you can also torch a lot of resources with, you know, airy hopes that really just don't advance anything. So, you know, this may complexify the area, and then individual decisions are made partly based on funding, the interest of journals. And somebody said, I think yesterday, maybe today, that people who researched psychiatric disorders were themselves stigmatized at some point. I know that when I decided that that I wanted to go into psychiatry instead of neurology, senior leaders at Harvard Medical School were aghast and derided. You know, one neurologist said, "They will ruin your mind." So those social forces are powerful. I was terrified, but didn't change. You know, but that hasn't answered your question, but and then companies, of course, are they're, you know, that they have investors and they're trying to make money, and sometimes they ask Brent's colleagues to be complicit in things that fortunately they're not willing to be complicit in.
I don't know, Brent, were you going to?
Did you
Go
want to
ahead.
respond? Okay, yeah.
I mean, I mean, another part of the answer perhaps, or how I see, I think it's a very good question, but part of the response for me is pointing it out, right? So pointing out that tactical reductionism is happening or has happened, and where the fallacy lies. And I thought it was actually really one of the strongest points of Steve's talk is actually pointing out that it's not that simple, and that is, I mean, and your comment of we ought not want to use these things in the clinical setting was really interesting, right? I think coming from a science leader, I think that provides some kind of guidance for others to think about these issues. In a similar way, I've just finished writing, we just submitted a paper on critiquing the facile use of African ethnic categories as historical realities, right? That are, you know, supposedly, or the way that they're currently treated in genomics literature is that those are real biological constructs rather than social constructs, which they are, right? Because people here similarly define themselves through historical and political processes in the same way that they do elsewhere in the world. So I think part of the job is pointing out where these reductionisms happen and where they are problematic. But an equally important part for me is activism and advocacy. And I find it, you know, I find the question of the extent to which academics have a moral duty towards activism is an interesting one, right? And you know, views on this differ depending on who you speak to. But it certainly seems to me that this is another important place where one needs to use one's skills to question strategic or tactical reductionism. And I think Stephen's point about, or example of the calling the FDA and calling out companies is one example, right? Some of the content that we try to weave into the WHO's genome editing recommendations and report is another example of kind of a, you know, gentle activism that seeks to question or challenge some of the ways in which this is treated in some of our domains.
I just had one thought, which is half baked, so bear with me. It really seems to me that tactical reductionism is driven by the way funding priorities are structured. And I think structuring funding priorities for NIH and other organizations must be a very, very difficult job, because you want to fund stuff that's going to work. But that probably conduces to a sort of conservatism over time.
Oh,
Scientists
yes.
propose stuff that is going to be funded, and they propose stuff that's understandable, and agencies want to fund things that are likely to succeed. So I wonder, and this is really speculation, could we get a handle on this simply by increasing funding for research and enabling us to take more risks? NIH, gets about $60 billion a year.
About 40 some odd, but it's a lot. But
and what does the U.S. military get as a whole?
Yeah, I know
$1
every
billion.
institute director had their eye on a B-2 bomber. That's my bomber. I want to sell that at a used car lot and use the money for medical research. But Brent, just increasing the amount of money is an experiment that has been done without success. I mean, again, we have to understand ourselves a little bit as humans. So the intramural programs, that is the government labs at NIH, people had just insane stable funding for years and years and years. And instead of taking big risks, they all ended up having CVs with 400 or 500 or 600 papers, as if St. Peter was going to weigh their curriculum vitae at the pearly gates. So there needs to be something else. And I think that something else are forces that are countervailing against, there are scientific fads, there are all kinds of forces at work. And if one, even very empowered people, try to sort of reallocate funds from an area that has gone stale to a riskier but promising area. In the United States, a group from a professional society will show up lobbying Congress. And then I spent many hours of anxious sweating, going from congressional office to congressional office, explaining why we weren't going to do this anymore because we had finite funds. And that was, according to the scientific community, much more promising. Scientists, like I said, are humans and they follow their incentives. And if they're feeling successful and you pull the rug out from under them, they're not happy with you.